right, friends, neighbors, countrymen. By the way, I know it's a little bit crowded up here, but if you want, you can probably squeeze in a little closer to the slides. Welcome to the session here about talking about agentic AI. Surprise, surprise, hot topic of the time. Short version of me is I've been a big martech nerd here for over 18 years, working operationally in martech companies, consulting with companies on brands adopting martech, and doing a lot of writing about martech at a site called chiefmartech.com. I figured maybe a good place to start is actually in preparing slides. I found myself thinking back to what was involved in creating a slide deck 50, 60 years ago. I mean, it was a lot of friggin' work, right? I mean, they were actually physically laid out on these boards, people using X-Acto knives and rubber cement. Nobody even knows what rubber cement is anymore, and then for each one of those, someone would have to take a photograph. That photograph would, that film would get developed, converted into 35 millimeter slides. I mean, this process was slow, laborious, took weeks, and as a result, there just weren't a lot of slide presentations. Up until, in the mid 80s when PowerPoint came out. Originally for the Mac, actually, before it got acquired by Microsoft. And then since then, I don't know, we went from maybe a few thousand presentations created every year to, I think the last stat I saw is there's something like 30 million PowerPoint presentations given every day. Now, obviously, the easy joke would be I'm not sure all 30 million of those should be given. But there's no denying the fact that, this technology dramatically changed the curve of who could create and what it costs to create when it came to presentations. And now with AI, I mean, we can actually follow this thread a little bit further because there's a generation of these generative AI presentation tools. Gamma is one of the more popular ones at the moment. That I just walked through a few screens of this was literally me step by step saying, oh yeah, I wouldn't mind creating a presentation. I generate what would be the topic, the most creative things marketers can build on their own with AI. It takes a first pass at, well, all right, how about an outline of something like this to cover that? All right, well, if I want that, what sort of visual style do I want for this? And boom, within 30 seconds, it's got this whole deck of beautifully designed slides. Although I do notice, and you see all these weird artifacts with Gen AI, that they're not all in 16:9 format. Oh, well, that's kind of annoying. So I just ask it, can you make sure that they are all 16:9? And it has no problem doing that conversion. I bring it down to PowerPoint, and now, I can use this as at least the starting point for what I do. And to me, this is the perfect metaphor of what we're seeing across so many creative capabilities in marketing with AI, is things that used to take weeks, are steadily just dropping in the cost of time and resources, to a matter of minutes. And I would actually go a little bit further and say, I don't think it's just about the volume or the speed. I think what's exciting about a lot of these tools is I really do believe they expand the creative potential of what people can build. To me, this is, again, just sort of one piece of this phenomenal transformation that's happening, where we're going from a world that had, from a technology, a digital perspective, a fair amount of scarcity, to something that's increasingly defined by abundance, for better and worse. Speaking of worse for abundance, yes, over the years I have curated the crazy martech landscape. What started in 2011 is around 150 different marketing technology solutions on the market, and then just kept growing exponentially for years. Our most recent version in May of this year charted over 15,000 different solutions. I'm thinking 25,000, that'll be next year. I know this is not at all readable. We can zoom in. Yeah, I feel like we should do a little game. I'll give $20 to someone who can tell me what is the company that's the third row from. All right, never mind. Best way this can be summed up is, what Gavin had to comment when we shared it on LinkedIn is my eyes, they burn. At this point in time, really the only thing that's useful about this is the recognition that oh my God, there is a lot of marketing technology in the world. And don't worry, because there's more. Now, you know, that chart is absolutely a terrible way to represent the marketing technology space because every single one of those little micro dots is equally unreadable. In reality, if you were to like lay these out on a graph based on the scale of the companies, you know, their market share, their annual revenues, it would be this long tail distribution. You know, there's maybe a couple dozen major platforms, you know, multi-billion providers. There's maybe a couple hundred, like, you know, leading horizontal platforms that, you know, over 100 million revenue, and then this massive long tail. You know, and it's not just like startups who someday aspire to become major platforms, although there's plenty of those. It's also more specialist tools in vertical markets or particular regional solutions, or even software that's built for particular ecosystems, or we're seeing services companies, you know, bottle some of their magic and productize it as well. Now, this jump to over 15,000 products in the martech landscape, you know, just when I thought it was safe to go in the water, just when I thought it was almost starting to reach peak martech a couple years ago, well, of course, that's when the Gen AI explosion hit. And we saw this crazy jump, you know, particularly in the categories around commerce and sales tools and, not surprisingly, content and experience tools. And so from 23 to 24, like even on the sales and commerce side, it was almost 50% growth of tools in that category. Now, this past year, from 2024 to 2025, it started to level out again, and generally a little bit more distributed, about 10% growth across all categories. But still, when you're starting from a baseline of like 14,000 tools, 10% growth is, it's a lot. But what's actually happening with this stuff with AI? All right, well, we did, as part of the analysis for that updated landscape, we did a survey of a number of different folks who had been adopting AI in marketing. And it was fascinating. It kind of mapped to Everett's diffusion of technology curve, where we saw like, okay, definitely for the use of AI assistants, they really have crossed the chasm in a remarkable time frame. You know, something like 800 million users for ChatGPT. Most marketers are, at least to some degree, working with a ChatGPT or a Gemini or a Claude. But although there's been a lot of talk about, oh, well, that's nice with AI assistants, what about agentic workflows and AI agents? That, at least back in the spring, we still found pretty much for early adopters. You know, so I brought a little bit of the data for this. And by the way, this whole deck we can make available to you, you know, as a PDF. So I've got a bunch of data in here. You don't have to worry about like trying to jot down. Definitely using standalone AI assistants, essentially 88% of the folks are doing that. When you start asking about using more co-pilots or assistants built into martech tools themselves, that's considerably less. You know, it's maybe about 55% or so are using some sort of AI co-pilot within one or more of their martech tools. As has been almost the perennial theme in martech, of course, the challenge is very often integration. All these different tools we have in our stack, how do we actually get them to work well together? With AI, we're finding that it kind of follows the same pattern that, you know, less than half saying like, okay, well, we can kind of get it working with some of our stuff, you know, but they're very, the majority of folks are still saying like, yeah, no, it's a cool technology, but how do we actually integrate it into our operations? Now, what's exciting in martech about generative AI in particular is it's starting to unlock some new capabilities that before were like very, very hard. To me, the most exciting thing is this ability to unlock interesting use cases with unstructured data. It was just very hard to do before. So we had brought some data of that and found that, you know, about 65% of the folks we had talked to here, you know, they were starting to experiment with some sort of way of like, how do we at least make sure we're getting this unstructured data? You know, even if we aren't fully yet able to operationalize on it yet, we realize this is going to be the opportunity moving forward. The next step of that is like, okay, well, if you've got some of that unstructured data, you know, are you actually, you know, applying any of this with LLMs, you know, generative AI engines? And there, drops down. It's, different use cases. I'd say the most common one we've seen have been like, summarizing messages and content. Probably the most common example, quite frankly, particularly in B2B, was always around like, call summaries and being able to do analysis on call conversations. Useful stuff. But we're starting to spread our wings and look at some new capabilities. Now, in this context of adopting more generative AI capabilities into our marketing operations, I want to dispel a bit of a myth that more generative AI is always better. One of the other speakers this morning I thought really nailed this as well too. There's a difference. I'm just going to go ahead with this full build. The world we have come from of these very deterministic and structured automations, they have their limitations. They tend to be very fixed. They can be fragile, if they don't adapt, if things sort of change around them. But they have a lot of benefits. They are predictable. They run in the same consistent way. You have explainability. You have control. There's a lot of things there that are actually still very useful. Versus when you look over at the pure agentic side, and there are very few examples now where people are truly running, agents driving, all of the reasoning for them, or networks of agents collaborating together. A lot of visions there, but, not a lot that's, in production yet. A lot of power there, but it's sort of now making this trade-off from determinism to non-determinism, where, okay, these non-deterministic agents, in some ways, they become a little bit more resilient. They have the ability to adapt because they can reason. But they also tend to introduce more variance into the equation. And I think this is where, we don't have to look at this as one extreme or another. As we're figuring out what are the right places where we're able to bring this technology into marketing operations, it's also perfectly fine to look at this as a continuum. We see a lot of marketers now saying like, okay, we're generally keeping these deterministic, well-structured automation workflows, but we're starting to introduce pieces of generative AI technology to like, oh, do this particular activity with this unstructured data, or generate this particular thing within a certain set of parameters. I just want to emphasize, this is not a maturity model. The goal is not to get from the left side to the right side. It's a spectrum of different approaches we can use to between structured deterministic automation and more agent-based approaches. All right, so picking up with the survey, we're now asking folks like, okay, well, if you are starting to experiment with bringing generative AI into some of your workflows, where are you doing this? And actually, it turns out most folks have been doing it in their core marketing platforms. Whether it's a CDP or a map or a CRM, a lot of these vendors have definitely, helped make these capabilities accessible that way. The whole set of vendors who we used to refer to as iPaaS, integration platform as a service, Zapier and Workato and folks like that, N8N, they've done a wonderful job of also expanding their capabilities to essentially be agentic automation solutions, and then sort of goes down from there. One of the other ones, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, that is very intriguing to me is like, okay, with the AI agents that aren't being used behind the scenes, but ones that actually interact with customers. The main use case that really started to gain traction this year was this next generation of chatbots on websites. Let's face it, we've had chatbots on websites for a long time. They've almost all sucked. This past year, they started to actually get better. Because by using LLMs within these chatbots, like inheriting that really terrific conversational capability, that generative AI has, and then also we're starting to see people get better about piping the right data, particularly for customer service, with knowledge bases and access to, ticket histories that actually then give those things a chance to have a much higher resolution rate with customers. It's not perfect, but even getting to a place where there's like, sort of the stats I find most credible around 50–60% resolution rate, where a customer can self-service and answer right away, that's actually a wonderful thing. Again, as long as for the other 40–50% of the cases, they can very quickly get to a human. All right, but now things get really interesting, because this was just almost sort of looking at this through the lens of like, okay, that crazy martech landscape, there's becoming more AI products in here, we're starting to see more agentic capabilities spread throughout it. In some ways, though, the much more interesting story to me is what's happening even beyond that commercial martech landscape. And if the commercial landscape has been a long tail, I get fascinated by what we would call the hypertail of more and more custom software that is being built. Now, a lot of this software, is being built by professional IT developers who are leveraging AI tools to accelerate their work. But you've also seen over the years better and better no-code tools. We'll talk about some of them. But even one of the most interesting ones is this thing that we now have these AI assistants that are actually generating software and running software, and we don't even necessarily know it. I'll give you a very clear example. So I went to Claude. I said, go get me a list of the most valuable companies in the world for the past 20 years. I want you to draw an area chart of that growth over time, but split the chart into two groups, tech companies versus non-tech companies. About 10 seconds later, it comes back with this, and okay, cool, that's kind of exactly what I wanted. Mark Andreessen said back in 2011 that software is eating the world. It very clearly ate the stock market. Now, there wasn't any software development involved in this, of course, right? Well, actually, unless if you plug in on a little icon in Claude to see what was happening behind the scenes. And what Claude had done is it had pulled the data, and then it wrote a JavaScript and like a React little web front end to generate that chart. It wrote it, executed it, gave me the result, and then no longer needed this code. And just to think about that for a moment, I mean, this is kind of wild, right? That you now have these dynamic software programs that blink into existence, run, and then go away. Now, is that any less legitimate of a software program? I don't know. We can have a philosophical debate. But to me, it is all part of this adventure we're on of the democratization of this technology. I mean, technologies generally start out where they can be used by experts in the technology, discipline experts. Over time, they then start to get leveraged by domain experts. Like the perfect example of this would be when marketing operations started to have more and more control over a set of tools they could use. And as the technology gets packaged and easier to use in other ways, power users and then eventually regular users start to be able to work with it more directly. And kind of basic economics is the cost and expertise required drops. As you go from left to right, the sort of volume and production rate tends to go up. And we've seen this. Another way of looking at this is not just the who does this, but how. Moving from code to low code to no code to, that example we just looked at from Claude, which is AI agents just dynamically creating little programs. Now, creating little programs. There's a lot of fun stuff we've been talking about this year, and the language for this, we give credit and blame to Andrej Karpathy, who was one of the original folks at OpenAI and has since moved on. But back in, I think it was February, he had said there's this new kind of coding. I'm going to use what I imagine the voice for it, that I call vibe coding, where you fully give into the vibes, embrace exponentials, and forget the code even exists. I'm not saying that drugs were involved in this, but if they were, we wouldn't really be surprised. It's like this bizarre mashup of 60s counterculture and 2020s techno-optimism. I kind of feel like, the 60s, they got the summer of love. Here we got the summer of vibes. I don't think we got the better one. And just to poke a little fun at this for a moment, I want to translate this language. Vibe coding, this is kind of what we've been calling no code and low code for years. Vibe marketing, some people are talking about that. I kind of think that's what growth hacking has been. Vibe selling, have you ever heard that one? It's hustle culture. Vibe finance, I think the best answer to that is calling it creative accounting, or what the SEC calls fraud. Vibe anything wasn't that long ago. Vibe anything, that's shadow IT. All right, one more little joke if you'll entertain me, because I was playing around a bit with Sora, where you just take a little thing of your face and voice, and then it goes off and creates something for you. Oh, sorry, it's the slide after this. I'll share that. All right, one thing I do want to say about vibe coding is, for non-engineers, it's useful for a relatively narrow set of things. Jason Lemkin, who runs SaaSter, did some experiments with vibe coding for his own business over the summer, and he documented on LinkedIn his adventures, and so he had things like, oh, there's stuff that's safe to do, and there's stuff he tried that got him into a lot of trouble, and so I've sort of nicknamed this the Lemkin scale vibe coding, where, in the green side of it, doing like basic little web apps, being able to do like internal dashboards, small little workflows within teams, it can actually be really useful for folks. And this is stuff that would have been hard or expensive, for a typical marketer to get done before. So it's like almost an underserved set of options. Once you start dealing with customer data, now you're getting into some territory where you actually want some eyes on it that know what's going on there. The more complex it gets, the harder that's going to get as well too. And what you apparently definitely do not want to be doing is, using vibe coding to create your own, reinvent Salesforce. Even Mark Benioff would not attempt to recreate Salesforce with vibe coding. All right, now I've got my little Sora thing, because.
Like, hey man, I'm totally coding the vibes. I just think of a CRM and it appears. Poof.
All right, I don't have any good explanation for that. All right. Sorry, this is why my family does not let me use Sora anymore. They're like, stop it, Dad. So I just want to lean in a little bit more. Again, you can't create your own CRM. You don't want non-engineers creating advanced software. But there's so much software that we have the potential that falls in this category of really simple things, or things that are only going to be used internally. They might only be used by a few users, even like a single user who's just trying to optimize their workflow. Things that might have a short lifespan, like, oh, we're going to do this little app to do this thing for an event, and then after the event, the app goes away. There is definitely risk profiles. Again, like if you're working with customer data, sensitive data, that's a very different risk, profile than if you're not. But then even one of the most interesting ones for me is this idea of ambiguous ideas. Marketers in particular, not to pick on them, I love them, have a lot of ideas, but they don't always get born perfectly formed. And it's very hard to communicate to a software developer what exactly you want as you're still sort of working through that. And vibe coding has given marketers this ability to sort of develop and prototype ideas. I think is incredibly powerful. And again, sort of this is a nod to Clay Christensen's disruptive innovation. It's these things that have just been traditionally underserved. It just wasn't worth having professional software developers, spend expensive time on those sorts of things. Some of this AI vibe coding stuff, I think, unlocks new productivity there. All right, so just have about 5 more minutes or so. I want to share something with you that is definitely a work in progress. So any feedback you have, greatly appreciated. But been trying to think through the different kinds of agents that we're dealing with in marketing. And I'd hypothesize that they're actually in 3 very different domains. There's a set of agents that we use internally, for optimizing our creation, our production, our analysis of work backstage with marketing. There's agents for customers that we as marketers control, but they're really meant to serve customers. Those chatbots, customer service chatbots are one. In some circles, it's become fashionable to have AI SDRs. I won't hold judgment on that at the moment, other than to say that's an example of letting an AI agent interact with your prospects and customers on your behalf. But perhaps the most interesting to me, and by far potentially the most disruptive, is this emergence of more and more agents of customers. These are agents being run by the buyers under their control, not ours, and how we have to think about adapting how we do marketing to not just serve the humans, but their AI agents operating on their behalf. So, to try and make this concrete, because I love little logos on a slide, what can I say? Started to put some examples of okay, well, these are the kinds of different categories of agents for marketers. Some of the different categories I would see of agents for customers, aside from the ones I mentioned, there's some really interesting things with shopper concierges, in e-commerce. And then the agents for customers, again, the most popular are probably, the major AI assistants like Claude and, ChatGPT. But there's a lot of other interesting things starting to happen there too with, content remixing. You're seeing some of these agentic browsers that let people change very much their experience on your website. Even further down in B2B, you're starting to see some interesting things with more and more advanced procurement AI agents. These are all going to become things we need to factor in. Now, I want to take a moment to just say, by the way, on these agents for customers, one of my struggles with automation applied in marketing and customer experience is, automation is very often thought through the lens of making things more efficient for the company. We're not always great at thinking through the impact that has on the efficiency or the experience for the customer. The most example you're probably all familiar with is the IVR tree from hell that was very efficient for the company to we'll just send them all to the IVR. You as the customer trying to navigate that, not so great. I won't beat this horse at the moment other than to say anyone responsible for customer experience, just keeping this front and center as we're starting to bring more and more of these agents to life, super important. By the way, do any of you follow Tom Fishburne, Marketunist? If you take one thing away from my presentation, it's subscribe to Tom. He writes a weekly cartoon that always captures, to me, just the essence of the craziness. Our new marketing AI agent will help us engage customers like never before. And then, of course, on the other side, our new customer AI agent will help us ignore marketers like never before. And we can joke, but some of this stuff with agentic browsers, some of what we're starting to see with more and more of agentic management of email, it's real. Now, we don't control what happens on that right-hand side of this, but we can influence different pieces of it. This is, arguably SEO and what we did with Google optimization for years is an example of that. But now there's a whole flurry of products and innovators and entrepreneurs trying to help bring that same sort of influence to how your brand shows up in AI assistants when people are engaging with them. So it's funny. A few years back, what was this, 2022, I think, for Gartner, they had asked a whole bunch of CEOs, when do you expect machine customers, what we would now call, these agents of customers, become a significant part of what you have to deal with as a business? And, again, this is just CEOs taking a guess, so we won't hold them, to the fire here. But generally, it's sort of it was oh yeah, probably around 2030. But if you've been following these things that have been announced from OpenAI, from Perplexity, from Microsoft, this is actually changing very rapidly. Some of the deals that OpenAI launched, with Shopify and Etsy, and then even just a few weeks back with Walmart, so that people are actually able to do purchases through these conversations with these assistants. This is a major thing to deal with. So I want to leave you with one last thought. Because here I've probably assaulted you over a 25-minute period with all these things are changing, and you already know there's a lot changing and trying to wrap your arms around it. It's exciting and it's incredibly stressful. The stress comes from, in my opinion, this relationship between technology change and organizational change that I dare say is like an empirical law. Tech changes at an exponential rate, like Moore's law doubling every 2 years or so, is sort of the quintessential example of that. And we just know organizations were just much slower at change. And because of all the technology that just keeps changing around us, I humbly suggest this is the quintessential management challenge, of our time. And sad to say, there's no silver bullet to this. The only thing I've seen is, two things I've seen about how companies do a better job of managing this than their competitors. One, they do make very clear prioritizations, strategic choices about which changes to embrace in what priority, and they're perfectly fine like leaving a number of things off to the side. You just can't boil the ocean with all of this. And the second thing is, no company changes at an exponential rate. Some companies change and adapt faster than others. For many years we used to call this, adopting, agile and agile management. You don't even have to be dogmatic about the approach to it, but basically from a technical architecture all the way through sort of the, team management side of things, being able to be more agile is one of the best ways to really navigate through all this incredible change. The folks at Agile Sherpas, who are kind of like one of the leading groups that do a lot of training on agile marketing for folks, they had actually surveyed a bunch of their folks, about just the speed of adoption of AI within those cohorts. And those that are like already fully trained and already running agile processes on a regular basis were just much further ahead in bringing AI into production use cases, because again, they sort of develop these muscles of adaptability. And I humbly say, if you can do both of these, if you can do the hard work of making those choices of where you're going to lean in, and do the hard work of developing that agility and that adaptability, it's not going to be a silver bullet. But I think it's a great way to be able to get ahead of your competitors who are definitely going to struggle with both of those things as well. So with that, I know I've come up to time. All the data that I shared in that is available in a PDF. You can just get directly. There's no gate or anything like that. And of course, if anyone wants the slides, we can get these for you too. But I believe we're coming to the end of the day as well too. So thank you for joining me for one last session.